Well, I think the dealers who think about their business in a data-driven and a financial metrics way, I believe get a significantly better financial outcome in the end.
There's going to be more makes, more models, more change.
Yep.
It's not going to stabilize.
Exactly.
And therefore, you just have to keep flicking that car quickly to get the new car in and price it accordingly. Glenn.
Craig, welcome back.
Welcome back. How you been?
Been great. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very good, thank you. I'm very good. I believe we're talking about pricing today, of which you are the guru.
It's my favourite topic.
It's your favourite
Used
topic.
car prices.
Well, I'm glad about that because whenever I go to a dinner party, people assume I know valuations of cars. It's the one thing they ask: how much is this car worth? How much is my car worth?
You power the valuation tool on the DubiCars website. That's real time to your desk.
I'm sitting there basically giving prices.
Yeah.
And to be honest with you, I think it's a real challenge giving someone a valuation and a price in this marketplace. So I'm interested in this podcast because you are going to tell us all how to do it properly.
That's why we have a business. If it was easy, you wouldn't need us. So that's what we've built our whole business around, used car pricing.
Excellent. And for those that are tuning in, this is not just for car dealers. We're also going to give some consumers some great advice as well from a valuation point of view. So, and I am a consumer, so I'm looking forward to this. So, all right, Glenn, let's take it from the top. Take it from the top. What are the things that we need to think about or dealers need to think about that have an impact on pricing? Over to you.
Well, we could talk about this for hours, but the used car market is really about supply and demand. How much supply of used cars in the market and how demanded they are. That's really, when I think about used car pricing, what it comes down to at its core. But of course, there's always other things too. Some cars are, and I like to think these factors are encapsulated in supply and demand. But there's other factors. There's things like, is it a good car? Is the car popular? And then there's also new car pricing. New car pricing really impacts used cars.
Oh, 100%.
And that's probably a good place to start today. How is new car pricing affecting used cars?
Okay. Well, let's start then with, from a manufacturer point of view, how do they even think about how to price a new car when entering this marketplace?
Yeah, so when manufacturers do this, they normally go through a competitive analysis process.
You help them with this, do you?
We help manufacturers with this. And in my previous life, working with some of the dealers in the Middle East, I sat through many of these meetings, thinking about when does the new model come out, where does it sit from a pricing position. So when manufacturers price their cars, they normally look at their competitive set. So they've identified competitive cars. And then they normally look at the features of their car versus the features of the other car. And they also think about where does the brand sit in the market? Do they want to position premium? Are they trying to position best value on price? They take all of those things into account and they come up with a retail price of the car. Of course, they also take into account the cost price of the car, but that's actually normally a secondary decision. It's not the primary decision manufacturers make because you see in different markets, the same car will have dramatically different pricing. And that's because in different markets, they're positioning the car at a different brand position or against a different competitive set of vehicles.
Does the OEM consider, or the manufacturer consider, the used car pricing when they're thinking about new car pricing, or is that a totally different team that thinks about that?
Look, traditionally they haven't, because manufacturers are in the business of building a car and selling it. What happens in the used car market traditionally hasn't necessarily entered the thinking too much. That's not the business they're in. Having said that, more and more manufacturers are understanding the link of used cars, how total cost of ownership plays into consumer choice, how residual value plays into consumer choice, and they're understanding that if their cars have a strong residual value, it's got a lower total cost of ownership to the consumer, and that in effect drives new car sales. So it is becoming more and more of a factor in new car pricing.
Okay. Yeah, well, look, it makes absolute sense, right? Because especially if they want to support their dealer network, they need to make sure that they can hold a good price on their used car. Yeah. And there isn't a massive gap between the used car price and the new car price, because then that's going to make it hard then to maintain both new car and used car pricing.
Yeah, but when new car prices rise or decline, it does impact the used car prices. If a new car price rises, that typically pushes more consumers into the used car market. So suddenly there's more demand, and that pushes up used car prices as well.
Yeah.
So there is a knock-on effect.
And I guess a great example of that would be, post-COVID, where there was just lack of quality used cars because there hadn't been enough new cars made, and we saw that price bump. I think we did a podcast on that actually. It was probably one of our better ones. But all right. So what? So new car prices obviously has an impact on used car. Is there anything else to understand about that in terms of the impact?
Well, I think the other thing to think about is things like model year and model life cycle. When the new model comes out of a vehicle, there's obviously a knock-on effect into used cars. Consumers want to upgrade. It might change consumers' feeling about driving a car that's no longer the latest on the road. So definitely model life cycle has a knock-on into used car pricing.
Yeah. I guess, with the EV market where we're seeing new models coming out so quickly, that's one of the challenges for EVs, I guess, in terms of holding price, because every month there's a new model coming out, unless you're Tesla.
Yeah, for sure. There is, that impacts it, but it's also just in the same model. One thing we did a lot of research on was when the Land Cruiser changed over, one of the top selling cars in the Middle East, what happened retrospectively a few years ago when the 300 series Land Cruiser was released, what happened to the 200 series used car prices? And what do you think happened, Craig?
Well, basically all my assumptions are always wrong. So my assumption would be the price went down, but I'm going to guess the price went up.
Yeah, and let me explain why.
There you go.
So the first thing about a new model launch is typically, not always, but typically the new model's more expensive. And we're not talking 1% to 2%. We're often talking, in that 3% to 7% range. So typically the new model's more expensive. And what we saw when the 300 series Land Cruiser was released, we actually saw a 10 to 15% rise in the first 6 months of used car prices. That increase in new car price pulled the used cars up. People who couldn't afford to buy the new Land Cruiser bought a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old 200 series. And it actually pulled up the used car prices. So it did the opposite to what a lot of people intuitively think. And not every new model launch does that, but it was really interesting.
So from a consumer point of view then, that's quite an important data point, isn't it? Because if you're holding on to a car where a new model's coming out, it could either have a negative or a positive impact on your price.
Of course, yeah.
So what should a consumer do then if that's the case? So I'm holding on to, let's say, a Terramont, and I knew the new Terramont's coming out. I do own a Terramont, by the way. And the new Terramont's coming out. What should I do? Should I be selling it before the new Terramont comes out? Should I be selling it as the new Terramont comes out?
Well, I mean, I'll preface this by saying this is not investment advice, and cars probably aren't an investment either.
So, exactly. Yeah.
or maybe not Terramonts anyway.
Yeah, not Terramonts, no.
Look, it's really hard. I mean, cars are a personal decision. If obviously it has to work financially for you and how long you normally keep your cars. Having said that, though, I think if you are considering selling it, and there's a new car coming out, typically, more often than not, the new car will be more expensive, so that'll push up in the short-term used car prices. So often the best time to sell is somewhere around a little bit before or in the months after the new car comes out.
Okay, that's good advice. And so from a dealer point of view then, what should they be thinking when new models come out?
Well, it can be a double-edged sword. While new car prices do rise, there's also more trade-ins too, so often supply will increase in the market as well. I think the best advice that I can give to dealers is don't try and time the market. Try and buy and sell in the same market. And that really comes down to keeping a really low average days of used car stock, making sure that you're turning your stock over really quickly. We're talking 20 to 40 days, sort of 2, 3, 4 weeks, so that you're buying and selling in the same market, not buying in one market and selling in a different one, because that could go either way.
Yeah. It is funny listening to you talk. I mean, it is almost, you are giving financial advice. Don't time the market, diversify your stock portfolio,
Of course.
It is financial advice almost, isn't it, in terms of how a dealer needs to think.
Well, I think the dealers who think about their business in a data-driven and a financial metrics way, I believe, get a significantly better financial outcome in the end.
Yeah, 100%. So I would imagine for an official dealer where you're just focused on one brand and you have the support of the manufacturer, these decisions are slightly easier because you do get the support of the manufacturer and you're focused on one brand.
Yeah, but manufacturer support typically doesn't help their used car department. Normally manufacturer support is around new cars, and manufacturers are changing. They're providing more support to used cars because they're thinking about the whole life cycle. But I actually think sometimes the manufacturer used car dealerships have it tougher. For example, if you're an independent used car dealer and there's a new model coming out, you might decide that that's too much risk. You're just not going to stock that model for the next 6 months until you see how the market settles. But if you're a branded dealer and you have to have those cars in stock, you've got no choice.
Yeah. But, if you assume that, that, I don't know, actually, how many makes and models are there? I reckon there's 5,000-6,000. Then you add trim on, there's 15,000-16,000. Are we close to that? Or
No, you're nowhere near it, Craig.
how many?
Well, we make a catalogue of every vehicle that's been officially available in the UAE in the last 13 years. And we have 28,000 unique vehicles that have been officially available.
That's with trim.
That's with trim
Yeah.
and model year and
Yeah.
even down to seats. Because when you're valuing a used car, there's a 5 or a 7-seat version. One's worth different to the other.
But that's going back over
13 years.
13 years. So on the market at the moment available, because that's going back 13 years, right? They're not all available today.
Of course.
So but let's say there's 15,000, 16,000 make model trims available on the market now, which is still even
Huge.
It's huge, right?
Yeah.
So how does a used car dealer take your advice and think about how they price based on all the stuff that you talk about in terms of what impacts on price? That's a lot of things to consider.
Yeah, and it's not easy being a used car dealer, Craig. It is harder than it looks, and especially to do a good job of it. So it's not easy, and ultimately, in my opinion, it just all boils down to supply and demand, understanding how much demand there is for the car in the market, how much supply there is, and then pricing the car correctly, understanding the correct options of the car, the correct features of the car, where that car sits in the current market, and whether this car's unique, it's got extra features and it's a premium price, or whether this car's maybe higher mileage and doesn't have the extra features and needs to be a lower price. So really understanding the car you're selling, understanding the market and where those two fit into each other.
Yeah, and making it a data-driven
Exactly.
Structure. In terms of the changes that we're seeing with EVs coming to the market, the demand for hybrids, all the new models. What are you seeing there in terms of across those different cars?
Yeah, well, when it comes to the used car prices, it's not good news when it comes to the EVs. We're seeing it's a really immature market for used EVs. There's a real lack of participants in the marketplace would be what I'd say. I think dealers are too nervous to sell used EVs. I think consumers are very nervous buying used EVs. They've got concerns about the battery and warranty and these sort of things. And I think this market's still very at the early stage for EVs. We've got infrastructure issues. I think there's no tax incentives or big cost savings to switching. Fuel's relatively cheap. So I think the used car EV market is really, it's barely there. It's really finding its legs.
I guess if you live in the UAE, realistically, you kind of need to have a villa to have an EV to make it work, right? So
exactly.
You think about how many drivers you're cutting off if you've got to have a villa. And if you've got a villa, you can probably afford a new EV rather than a used EV. So yes, you can see the dynamic there. What about hybrids though? Because we love a hybrid here, don't we?
It's the best of everything, Craig.
Oh.
And I think we're going to talk about that in a future episode.
We
But
are.
I think in this market, as in the UK as well, I've got some interesting stats on that. I think hybrids are currently the sweet spot.
Yeah, I can't wait for that episode actually because there's so much data to unpack there. But okay, and sort of petrol engines, larger petrol, smaller. Are you seeing any dynamic there?
I think that I think this is one of the few markets globally that is really strong on large petrol engines. Having said that, fuel prices continue to rise. People are more conscious of their environmental footprint. There is a trend to smaller petrol engines, and of course, they're becoming more efficient. But, I think there's still plenty of market there for large petrol engines too.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear. So I have a V8 as well, Raptor. So
Nice.
All right. Okay. So anything else that you're seeing in the marketplace that either is good for consumers to know about or dealers to know about when it comes to pricing?
Look, I think it's about understanding the characteristics of the car, what the model year is of the vehicle, which of course is different to production year and these sort of things. So understanding the model year, understanding what's going on right now and in the future. And then really for dealers, I think the big takeaway is understanding the cars you've got in stock, where they sit in the market, where that car is in the model life cycle, and buying and selling in the same market. To keeping your stock turn quick, increasing your stock velocity, get those things right, and it all starts to get easy.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I think, thinking about that velocity model, thinking about selling that car quickly,
Yep.
pricing it to sell quickly is key, right? Because the one thing that we can forecast here and now is there's going to be more makes, more models, more change.
Yep.
It's not going to stabilize.
Exactly.
And therefore, you just have to keep flicking that car quickly to get the new car in and price it accordingly. So then, that's
minimizes your risk.
Minimizes your risk. Absolutely. That is great advice. Well, look, the other advice I'm going to give to consumers who ask me about pricing is to speak to you, not to me, because you are the expert. So that's the other thing I'll give consumers.
Yeah, they can visit our website and we'll steer them in the right direction.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you very much for that, Glenn.
Thanks, Craig. I'll
See you
next time.
soon. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.